Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bible study. I hope you're having a great day today and doing well. And today we're going to be in our study, The Historical and Spiritual Rise of Islam through a Biblical Lens. And yesterday I did a preface to this study. You can go back and watch that. And today we'll be in part one, and we're going to be talking about the lineage of Ishmael and Genesis promises. And I'm going to do this study a little bit different in that I'm going to give you the verses that we need to study, and you go and study them in a way that you're comfortable with in your own Bible and your own translation. Go and study these verses. I'm going to give you the breakdown of the verses and a lot of details with that, but I recommend that you go and get those yourself. And I want to do it in a way that you will get the most out of these verses, because this is a very important topic. Just today, we had another woman arrested plotting a terrorist attack in New York against the New York State Capitol in the name of Islam. It's a very important subject, and I want to make sure you get the most out of it. The last part of this study today, what we're going to do is we're going to go and I'm going to give you some discussion questions. And I'll give you the answers and we'll talk about those discussion questions, but go in and do your own analysis. Take those questions and do your own analysis and come up with your own conclusions on these questions. The focus of part one is going to be understanding the origins of the Arab peoples and the biblical promises given to Abraham regarding his firstborn son. So let's take a look at the verses we're going to study. The first one is going to be Genesis 16, 1 through, or Genesis 16, 1 through 16. We're going to be talking about the birth of Ishmael and the prophecy over his life. And then in Genesis 17, 18 through 21, we'll be talking about God's distinct covenants with Isaac and blessings for Ishmael. And then Genesis 21, verses 14 through 21, we'll talk about how God protects and provides for Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness. So let's start with Genesis 16, 1 through 16. And, this tells the story of Hagar, Sarai, and Abram. Because Sarai cannot have children, she gives her Egyptian servant, Hagar, to Abram as a wife. And Hagar becomes pregnant and looks down on Sarai, causing Sarai to mistreat her, so that she runs away into the desert. Now, while she's in the wilderness, an angel visits her. The angel finds Hagar by a spring and tells her to go back and submit to Sarah, and promises her son Ishmael, and made promises to her son and named him, and he would be named Ishmael, or God hears. And Hagar names God El Roy, the God who sees me, amazed that God notices her in her distress. And the passage also talks about the return, and how Hagar goes back and gives birth to a son, Ishmael. And it also comments on Abraham's age, that Abraham was 86 when Ishmael was born. So go in and read those verses. The next one we're going to study is Genesis 17, 18 through 21. And here, Abraham asked God to bless his son Ishmael. God responds that Sarah, now her name Sarah, will have a son named Isaac, through whom the main covenant will pass. However, God also promises to bless Ishmael, make him fruitful, and make him the father of 12 rulers and a great nation. So let me give you a little summary here. This passage, it details Abram's plea for Ishmael and God's response, confirming that the covenant through Isaac, while promising to bless Ishmael. Abraham's plea was in verse 18 here, and it talked about Abraham, expressed his hope that Ishmael might live under God's blessing. The promise of Isaac in verses 19 through 21, God states that Sarah will bear a son named Isaac, with whom everlasting covenant will be established. Now, there's a distinctive there. While Isaac gets the everlasting covenant, Ishmael does get a blessing. And the blessing of Ishmael, God promises to bless Ishmael, making him fruitful and father of a great nation. In Genesis 21:14 through 21, and you can read that story. The story tells of Hagar and her son Ishmael being sent away by Abraham into the desert of Beersheba. They ran out of water, and it talks about being saved by God, who hears the boy's cries, provides a well, and promises to make him a great nation. The passage talks about the departure of Hagar and Ishmael. Abraham gives Hagar food and a skin of water, sending her and the boy away. And she wanders into the desert of Beersheba. And there's a despair here. There's real despair. Not only is Abraham, he's saddened by the whole thing. Imagine having to, ostracize your son and the mother of your son. But here, the despair is the water runs out. Hagar places Ishmael under a bush and sits a bow shot away, weeping because she cannot watch him die. Divine intervention happens. God hears the boy's crying. An angel calls to Hagar from heaven, telling her not to be afraid and repeating the promises that make Ishmael a great nation. It talks about provision and growth. God opens Hagar's eyes to see the well of water, and God remains with Ishmael as he grows up in the wilderness of Paran, becoming an archer and eventually marrying a woman from Egypt. Let's talk about a little bit about these discussion questions, and I want to give them to you in a way that hopefully that you can understand these questions. Go and do your own research. How does God's response to Hagar in the wilderness, Genesis 16:13, where she names him El Roy, the God who sees me, demonstrate his heart for Ishmael and his descendants? And that's very important. God's encounter with Hagar demonstrate that he notices, values, and ultimately cares for the marginalized, bestowing personal promises and a future upon Ishmael and his descendants. There's evidence of God's heart for Ishmael. He's naming Ishmael. That name Ishmael means God hears. And there's personal promises. God gives Ishmael a destiny mirroring Abraham's line, promising that the descendants will multiply and grow a great nation, too numerous to count. There's a lot of talk about dignity to the outcast. By seeking out an abused, pregnant Egyptian slave in the desert, God proves that no person or ethnic group is invisible or outside his divine concern. And he's always talking about future security here. The Lord promises that Ishmael will be strong, independent, and untamed people. He calls him a wild donkey of a man in the passage, who will dwell in the presence of his brethren, securing an enduring place and presence in the region. In Genesis 16:12, Ishmael is described as a wild donkey of a man, whose hand will be against everyone. How should we interpret this idiom? Within ancient Near East culture, reflecting the independence and nomadic freedom versus modern assumption. So, what are we to make of that passage and of that name? He describes God. This is God describing Ishmael as a wild donkey of a man, an ancient metaphor that praised fierce nomadic freedom rather than insulting character. So it's not an insult to call a man a wild donkey of a man. Back then, in that culture, it was something that people revered, because it's an untamed survivor kind of mentality. The wild donkey lived in the dry desert where domesticated animals could not survive. It represented total freedom and the ability to thrive in harsh, empty lands. And it refuses domestication. Unlike a horse or an oxen, the wild donkey could not be broken or forced to pull a plow. Calling Ishmael a wild donkey meant that he would never be enslaved or controlled by settled empires. Now remember that. The hand against everyone. In a world ruled by powerful kings and cities and states, this phrase did not mean mindless violence. It meant that his descendants would live a nomadic life, refusing to bow to borders or taxes or foreign rulers. Their hands stayed ready to defend their independence. So let's look at one more of those discussion questions. How does distinguishing between God's covenant with Isaac and God's blessing with Ishmael shape how we view the geopolitical and spiritual landscape of the Middle East? So let's make sure that's a distinction that we know here. Distinguishing between Isaac's covenant and Ishmael's blessing frames the Middle East not just as a political struggle over land, but as a deep spiritual competition over divine favor and historical legitimacy. Think about that. The whole theological foundation in here is that the covenant with Isaac, let's take the covenant with Isaac and look at it. Genesis stated that God's covenant included a specific promise of the land, promises specifically through Isaac. Mainstream Jewish and many Christian traditions view this as a unique, binding, and legal spiritual title deed. We know that we have that. But there's the blessing of Ishmael. God also hears Ishmael and promises to make him a great nation with 12 rulers. Islamic tradition and Arab culture heritage often connected their lineage and God's physical blessing to Ishmael, seeing him as a co-heir to Abraham's legacy. Let's talk a little bit about those geopolitical views. Land ownership. Supporters of Israel use the Isaac covenant to argue that Jewish people have a divine right to the land. Others look at Ishmael's blessing and argue that Arab populations possesses the equal, valid, historical, and divine right to dwell in the region. There's a national identity that we must observe too. Nations in the Middle East often tap into these ancient roots to justify their sovereignty. Leaders may frame national borders and conflicts through the lens of ancient sibling rivalry and divine choice. But from a spiritual perspective, there's the exclusive and inclusive claims, and some religious groups may use the distinction to claim that only one lineage holds true spiritual value today. That's what we believe. While others believe and they emphasize that God's blessing, he blessed Ishmael too, meaning God cares for both Arab and Jewish people. And we know that to be true, that God does care for all people. The power of the narrative. Religious extremists on multiple sides use these texts to view the conflict as a holy war where compromise is impossible. Conversely, peacemakers use the shared father, Abraham, to call for reconciliation between descendants of both sons. So think about that for a minute before we go on to this last part. In the geopolitical struggle of things, the Arabs, and we'll get into why Arabs are Muslims, and they're not all Arabs are Muslims, but most Muslims are Arab, and that's where it started from. We'll get into that a little bit more. But in the geopolitical aspect of things, the Muslims use the blessing of Ishmael to do what they do and to claim what they claim, while the Jews and the Christians alike, we observe the blessing or the covenant of that God made with Ishmael to justify the things that we think and the things that we do. And we know the difference, and that God made the covenant with Isaac and not with Ishmael. So let's take a look at this last part. Long before the rise of Islam in the 7th century AD, Scripture outlines the lineage of the Arab peoples through Ishmael. God made an unconditional promise to Abraham that he would bless Ishmael, make him fruitful, multiply him exceedingly, and cause him to father 12 rulers, making him into a great nation. And that's in Genesis 17:20. However, God explicitly established his foundational redemptive covenant through Isaac. Understanding this distinction helps Christians see that the descendants of Ishmael are deeply rooted in biblical history and are the recipients of specific divine promises through distinct from the messianic line. And that's the important distinction. The messianic line was given through Isaac and not through Arab people. And we know that Jesus is the Messiah, and we know his roots and where he came from. Wow, we did everything in one part today in part one, and I am excited to bring part two tomorrow. Hopefully, we can get it done in one Bible study. Everyone, have a great day, and we'll talk then.